So we are still going through the 10 words, which for anyone not familiar with that is the way that the Bible actually describes the 10 commandments. They're basically 10 messages from God about what it really means to follow Him, to truly have faith in Him, and how that actually looks. And we've already seen as we've gone through this that though many people think that the first 4 relate to how we relate to God and the last 6 are about how we relate to one another, all of them really relate to that idea of actually both. They all show us what it means to truly love and follow both God and to love one another. And again, we've specifically seen that with the last couple, that when it comes to using the name of the Lord in vain, it has a lot to do with manipulating God or using God in one way or another to manipulate one another to whatever you think it's all about. And last week, we saw the commandment of the Sabbath having to do with God being worth the time. And when it comes to what God commanded of the people, He didn't just command some to rest, He commanded all of them to rest. And for even their animals and all the way down to the very least of them were supposed to participate in that rest. So it wasn't just about God, but it was also about how they related to one another in that way. And so as we go through all of these, we have to see how that works. And in these next few, or even the rest of them, we begin to see not only how we deal with one another, but it also tells us something about God and what He is. And you can see that through some of these titles, that I am the greatest Father, that helps us understand who God is and what He's all about, in addition to what it has to do with how we relate to one another. And so, as we get into this, the fifth one is honor your father and your mother, that your days may be prolonged in the land which Yahweh your God gives you. So, again, most of us have heard this before, that about honoring your father and your mother, honoring your parents, and obviously there's a lot of reasons for this and why this is the case, but as we look deeper into it, we see that it goes beyond just simply saying that. There's a lot more to it. It's not just simply as for them that you're going to live long in the land if you do this, though again, it also that would include doing some of the other commandments, but there's a lot more to it than just that simple one. Again, we've seen that with all of these different words. As you go deeper into it, you see all of what it's talking about. And so there's a few other places in Scripture that actually help us give some context for even what it meant for them beyond what we just simply think. One of them is found in the book of Deuteronomy in chapter 21. It says, if any man has a stubborn and rebellious son who will not obey his father or his mother, and when they discipline him, he will not even listen to them, then his father and mother shall seize him and bring him out to the elders of the city at the gateway of his hometown. Then they shall say to the elders of his city, this son of ours is stubborn and rebellious. He will not listen to our voice. He is a glutton and a drunkard. Then all the men of his city shall stone him, and he will die, so that you shall purge the evil from your midst, and all Israel will hear of it and fear. Now, this is all an interesting passage that we have here that sounds extremely harsh to us in many ways. But one of the first things you can actually notice in what it's saying is that though when we hear honor your father and mother, we think of little children doing that, here it's clearly referring to someone who is already an adult. Though for them, they considered somewhere in the teen years people to become adults earlier than we do, it still would be someone who was older, at least getting close to our age of 18, if not older than that, who is doing this. And part of the reason for that is that they lived with one another, that you didn't just move out away from your parents when you got married or did whatever. They continued to live within, at the very least, the land, if not sometimes within the actual household of them. So they were at these times still under the control of whoever the oldest living male was in the household. He was the one who was in charge of all of them. And so, again, they would be stuck, in a sense, honoring their parents until they were the one who was the oldest, and they became the one in charge. And so this applied to them beyond just childhood into adulthood, because, again, they were living within that household. And one of the interesting things is when you look deeper at what this passage specifically means, is that the reason why this is the case isn't because they cared so much about, this thing of honoring parents. It had to do with the fact that if they couldn't honor the authority of the one in charge of the household, they weren't going to honor the authority of the one in charge of society at greater. And it wouldn't just cause chaos within the household as it was doing in this situation. It would ultimately cause chaos to families beyond them, to all those people living in the land near them. And so it was showing them the fact that something had to be done. Otherwise, they were, again, going to cause problems for more and more people, and it was going to become a huge problem. So they had to take care of the problem before it basically destroyed all of society. And so, again, it might seem harsh in many ways to us, but there is reasoning for this. Again, we learn from this passage here that when it speaks about honoring parents, it's not just children, but it's also the adults who are to do so. And it's speaking not just within that relationship, but within authority at larger. Any kind of authority is really, in essence, what this idea speaks to, that we are supposed to honor those who have some kind of authority over us. And there's another passage in the New Testament where Jesus is speaking, and he was saying to them, "Well, you are rejecting the commandment of God in order that you might stand up your tradition. For Moses said, be honoring your father and your mother, and let the one speaking evil of father or mother be ending by death. But you yourselves are saying, if a man might say to the father or the mother, Corban, which is gift, which thing, if out of me you might be benefited, no longer are you leaving him behind to do anything for the father or the mother, invalidating the word of God by your tradition, which you gave over, and you are doing many similar things such as these." So basically the idea of what's happening here is that they had this tradition amongst them that they could claim something to be Corban, which meant given to God. And so because of that, it could no longer be used to do anything any longer. It was something that was set aside, basically wholly for God. And so they couldn't, so they were claiming that they couldn't use it to help out their parents, that it was something that was set aside just simply for God, and so it couldn't be used to benefit them in any way. And again, this shows not just how this idea continued on into adulthood with basically what we think of obeying, but it has to do with honoring in the sense of taking care of them, that as they got older, they couldn't take care of themselves as much, and so they needed someone to help them out, and so the children would step up and help out in that kind of a situation. And so that's the kind of idea of what was happening here, but specifically what was going on is that they had made this tradition about setting aside something for God, which at the heart of it had a reason for it, but what was ultimately happening is that they were taking it to this point where they were using it as an excuse to not be able to have to give stuff to their parents, that all they had to do was set aside something as being given to God, and they no longer had to use it to help out anyone else. Yet we know, if we really look at the heart of God and what he's all about, that if we were to set aside stuff as being given or holy to God, it could still be used to help other people out, because God cares about other people just as much as he cares about our respect and honor of him. But yet they were not just doing that, but they were breaking commandments that God had given to them, the very things that, as Jesus said, Moses had given to them, that they claimed to be important. they were allowing people to break because they had this tradition that they considered more important than it. And so, again, when they got to that spot, they didn't care about honoring their parents anymore because they cared about looking good because they had set something aside for God that could be used in no way for anything else. But yet they weren't using it actually for God in any way, because if they had, they would have been using it to help their parents out in such a situation. Then in Colossians we see, children, keep obeying the parents according to all things, for this is well-pleasing in the Lord. Fathers, do not keep provoking your children in order that they might not lose heart. And so we see somewhat of a shift here of just speaking about how children are supposed to be interacting with their parents to also how parents are supposed to be interacting with their children. That in essence, these things go both ways. But we still have to understand the point that the children are called to obey their parents, to be honoring them as the commandment speaks about, because there's a reason for this, that parents have knowledge and understanding and stuff that they have to pass on to the children as they grow up, so that when they grow up, they'll actually be useful for society and helping out and doing what they ought to be when they are of age. And so, but it also brings up another point, that there is a difference between what you can call submission and obedience. And this comes specifically when we think about authority in the sense of government, that you can submit to the government without necessarily obeying everything they say. And this comes in those situations, as we would say, you do obey the government until they do something that's going to go against your conviction, specifically following God. But yet, to submit to the government in such a situation means that in your disobedience, you still accept the punishment that's going to come upon you because you chose to disobey in that situation. Though your disobedience was right because you were following God over them, you still have to deal with the consequences because the government still has authority over you. And again, the same thing can be said when it comes to parents and children, that sometimes parents might tell you to do something that's actually not a good thing for you, and you may have to not do it in that sense, but you may still have to suffer the consequences because of it. And so, again, when it comes to all authority, we see that what we can learn from this is that it's about submitting to that authority, not blindly obeying, but submitting to it in the way that we ought to. And it goes to the point of why the second part is there when it speaks to the fathers and the parents about how they're supposed to be treating their children, that they're not supposed to be provoking them or trying to cause them to do things wrong or to get to the point of where they lose heart. And that becomes an important part as well, is that the other side of it is that if you're setting your children up for failure and they're failing and then you're getting on them because of it, you're not actually helping them out in any sense, because, again, you just set them up for failure in the first place. And so it's not just about parents having authority in whatever way they want over children, but it's about them actually training up and helping the children become the people that they're supposed to be. And so when it comes to honoring your parents, it has that idea in mind that the parents are supposed to be someone worth looking up to and honoring, and then the children are supposed to respond in that way. But this also creates the shift to us to understand, as the title of the sermon is, of God being the greatest Father, that He gives us an example of what this looks like. And so the last passage I have here sort of helps us get a picture of that. It says, "For as many as by the Spirit of God are being led, these ones are sons of God. For you did not receive a spirit of slavery again into fear, but you received a spirit of adoption, in which we are crying out, Abba, Father. The Spirit Himself bears witness with our spirit that we are children of God. And if children, also heirs, on the one hand heirs of God, and on the other hand heirs of Christ, fellow heirs of Christ, since we are suffering together with Him, in order that we might also be glorified together. that we see what God does here is that he takes upon people being their father whom he didn't need to do so. Whether you want to say that we are all, in a sense, children of God because he created us, but have gone astray, in a sense, like the prodigal son. But when we come back, he accepts us with open arms, or if we were never his children, but he has adopted us to be so. Either way, it leads us to the point that God chose to do this. He chose for us to be his children when he didn't have to do so. That even though we had been disobedient in many ways, he still chose for us to be his children. And that's the kind of father that he is. He isn't one out of obligation like we might see today, or one who is abusive or absent or whatever else it might be, but he's the one who truly loves and has actually shown us the example of what that looks like. And so that's how we can get to the point of this fifth word having to do with him being the greatest father, because he is truly the one who is worth honoring above all else. And we have to recognize that though this still does relate how we deal with our earthly parents and with all kinds of authority, because again, this relates more broadly than just that. We have to first see that it's submission to God that we have to have, that's where all of this begins. But then we also have to recognize how authority works within our own society and submit within that as well, that's what God has called us to do. He's called us to live for him, but also live within our culture, the way that it's set up, the authority structures that are in it, in a way where we don't cause chaos by going so far against the grain that it just messes everything up. And so that's what all of this is trying to communicate, that it starts within the families of honoring our parents, but it also goes on beyond that to honoring others who are in authority for us. That we see glimpses of that in the New Testament, that sometimes we honor that authority not because they deserve it, but because we're treating them in such a way that it might change their mind. And sometimes all you have to do is act in the right way and allow others to see you and what you're doing, so that they then go and actually live up to what they're supposed to be in the first place. And again, that's what God did with us. He showed us his love upon the cross so that we could see him and what it's all about. We could learn from his example, and we could ultimately learn to live up to what he has called us to. And so that's what we need to hear from all this, that God is the example by which we need to live, and if we have authority over others, be in that authority. But he also shows us how the kind of people who we should submit to, and because we can submit to him above all else and we can trust him, it allows us to be able to submit to even those who might not actually deserve it. And that's the lesson that we can learn from this idea of honoring father and mother.